In May of 1924, teenagers Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb killed 14-year-old Bobby Franks. For months, the case made headlines around the world as people debated every aspect. What did it mean? What caused it? What needed to change in the world to make sure this would never happen again? Something about this case and these specific criminals compelled an extreme interest that still hasn't quite gone away, even more than a century later. And what I'd like to explore is how that interest has manifested in fiction. Since 1924, more than 200 pieces of media have been overtly influenced by the case, not including things that just throw in a mention. I'd like to look at how the story evolved over time, and what lesson each generation found in it. In my case, I became interested in the story in high school. I was really interested in the relationship between Leopold and Loeb and trying to understand the motive, which are pretty universal entry points into this case. But I stayed interested. I kept reading books, both nonfiction and fiction. I read the court transcripts, I read the psych reports, and then I started doing archival research. That's led to more than a decade of research in more than 40 archives around the country. In 2023, I published a biography of Nathan Leopold, and now I'm working on a book about the fictional adaptations. And in terms of parameters, I'm looking at anything that was even loosely inspired by the case. The plot and the characters might be totally different, but if somewhere along the line someone said that they were inspired by Leopold and Loeb when they were writing, it's in. I think these works can actually be really helpful in getting a sense of what a more general person who isn't doing a ton of research into the crime thinks about the case and what themes they're interested in. I'm also going to look at things that I don't have definitive proof are based on them, but I want to read them or watch them to get a sense for what I think. So there are a lot of usually books or TV episodes that a reviewer will say, this reminds me of Leopold and Loeb. And I look at it, and often Leopold and Loeb are even mentioned in the text. So I'm going to read these or watch these episodes to try to figure out, are there enough clues that this might actually have been inspired by the case, or is it just that a reviewer made a connection? While I have read or watched most of the adaptations that I know about, as I write the book, I plan to do a full, mostly chronological, reread, rewatch of the material. And as I go, I'd like to make videos reviewing and discussing some of the more notable adaptations. There are currently 174 things that I am looking to consume. These are all things that I have access to. So there are plenty of things that I know existed, but they were never published. I never was able to see them. I have not been able to get in contact with anyone who can give me a script, or especially there was a lot of plays in the 70s and 80s that are just, I can't find anything. I will still be looking at reviews. I will still be trying to see kind of the characterizations and the themes, and that's still part of this, but I can't actually experience them in the same way, obviously. And now, so this video that you're watching is intended as a kind of overview and introduction to the idea of this video series saga in my life. I don't know. I might not end up making videos if I find it's too difficult for me. I have a WordPress. I might just post stuff on there because that's easier, and I know that's what I know, Because I have read a lot of this stuff, but some of it's been years, maybe even a decade since I've read it. I'd really like to see how my opinion maybe changes, and I'm hoping that doing it mostly chronologically, I'll be able to see the change over time in a way that I couldn't if I was just grabbing books randomly. And I'm saying mostly chronological because there are some things that I can only access in certain places. Like one of the first adaptations, that 1924 silent movie, is only available in an archive in Belgium, and I will not be starting my journey there, so that's going to come up whenever I can take a trip to Europe, because I am in the United States. And there are 4 things I am currently having digitized at the UCLA Film and Television Archive. Those are mostly from the 60s. I think it's all 50s and 60s stuff. I'm hoping to go at the end of next month, so I will watch them probably way ahead of where I will be in my reread at that time. But that's just how it works sometimes. If you know of an adaptation that I don't, please tell me about it. If you have a book or a movie that reminds you of the case, if you've created a work of fiction yourself, please reach out to me. I want this project to be as exhaustive as possible. You can, comment below, or you can email me. My email address is theloebleopoldwp@gmail.com. If you want to check before you, send to me a full list of the fiction that I know for sure is based on them, can be found on my WordPress, and a list of fiction that might be based on them is also on my WordPress. And so if you want to check those, and if you find something that is not on either of those lists, oh my gosh, please reach out. I really, really want, even beyond this project, I just love consuming the fiction that's made about them. So I would love that. The only things I will be intentionally leaving out of this proposed video series and this video are discussions about the music and the poems that were inspired by Leopold and Loeb. I will be including those in the book, but I don't know how to talk about them in any kind of coherent way, except as kind of how I'm using them in the book so far is kind of as supplementary examples. I see a theme and then I say, and at this time there were a few poems and songs that also address that. Because I just can't talk for that long about a poem or a song. But I will say the best song about the case, in my opinion, is Bobby Franks by the Phantoms. Oh, and there's going to be spoilers in this video. Like, even saying something was inspired by Leopold and Loeb is probably going to give you an idea about, like, the themes and the characters, and if it's a mystery, you're probably going to have an idea about who the killers were. So there's really no point in not spoiling things, so... First, I want to do some background about the case to kind of establish some facts about the people we're talking about so we can see how their fictional counterparts drift or stay close to reality. So, in the Leopold-Loeb case, both the victim and perpetrators were born and raised in Chicago. They were all born to wealthy German Jewish families. Nathan Leopold was born to Nathan Sr. and Florence Leopold. He was seen as a prodigy. He was particularly interested in languages, religion, bugs, and birds. And he was uninterested in sports, and he was pretty arrogant, so most other kids didn't like him, but he did have cousins that he was close to. So he was not a total loner or anything like that. And then Richard Loeb was born to Anna and Albert Loeb. He was the third of 4 boys. He was also seen as a prodigy. He was homeschooled until the 3rd grade. He was more personable than Leopold. He had a wider group of friends once he started school, and he had particular interests in literature, history, and detective novels. They both graduated high school quickly and became friends in 1920 when Leopold was 15 and Loeb was 14. They started committing crimes and having sex pretty soon after that. Their crimes started with petty theft and escalated to stealing cars and going on joyrides, destroying property, and arson. In 1921, a friend walked in and saw them in bed together. He told their family and friends, and so they avoided each other publicly for a couple of years, though they still met in private, and they started hanging out in public again in 1923. In November of 1923, they decided to commit a perfect crime, which they determined would be a kidnapping for ransom. While successfully getting away with the ransom plot was the goal, they decided they would have to kill their victim to make sure they were never caught. That's something that you will see with the fiction, is it often morphs into thrill killers. They love killing, they get pleasure out of killing. That was not true of the actual case. So after months of planning, they carried out their plan on May 21st, 1924. Their victim was Robert Bobby Franks. He was their neighbor, and he was the youngest child of Flora and Jacob Franks. He was walking home from umpiring a baseball game after school when Leopold and Loeb picked him up. They hit him on the head with the handle of a chisel to knock him unconscious, put a gag in his mouth to make sure he couldn't scream, and he suffocated to death without Leopold and Loeb noticing. They had actually planned on just knocking him unconscious at that stage, and then later killing him together. Their plan was for them both to wrap a rope around his neck and both pull on it so that they would be equally culpable. But he died before they could do that. The killers buried or destroyed Bobby's belongings. They put his body in a culvert pipe in a forest preserve at the south side of Chicago. And then they were brought in for questioning, and they confessed 10 days later. At their sentencing hearing, they were defended by Clarence Darrow, who argued that they were mentally ill but not insane, and that their illness should mitigate their guilt. They were sentenced to life plus 99 years in prison, the judge specifically saying that he did that because of their ages, them being 18 and 19 at the time, and that they had pled guilty. So that's as much detail as I'm going to give you for now. More details about their lives will be given as we progress. So an important place to start is the fiction of 1924 itself. This includes, I'm not going to get into it here, but it includes a lot of newspaper stories which just were completely made up or heavily fabricated by reporters. It also includes newspaper comics. There were dozens and dozens of these like 5 or 6 panel comics or some 1 panel comics that discussed the case. There were also a lot of songs and poems. And we're also going to look at a novel and short story. All of these that I'm referring to were created in the spring, summer, and fall of 1924, while all of this was going on. This was in the newspapers at the time. In terms of the newspaper comics, the main themes were, theme number 1, Leopold was evil. So particularly before August of 1924, there was a definite sense in the newspapers that Leopold was worse than Loeb. That Loeb had likely been badly influenced or even hypnotized into committing the crime by Leopold. Leopold did not help this by talking to reporters a lot more than Loeb after they confessed, and being very, very brazen, very unapologetic, making jokes. Meanwhile, Loeb was saying he was sorry, he was fainting, he was crying, he wasn't talking very much, he wasn't eating very well, so he was seen as much more sympathetic. The idea did extend beyond that summer. This can be seen in a mock court that was actually held by a group of children in December of 1924. They sentenced their Leopold to death in the electric chair, which was not used in Illinois at the time. And they achieved this effect with batteries attached to a kitchen chair. And the jury in this case, the real case did not have a jury, but they had a jury. They set Loeb free. They decided that Leopold hypnotized him into committing the crime, so he was free to go. Second theme that you see a lot at this time is parents don't let your children go to college. So at this time, college was rapidly becoming popular with the middle class, and like with any big change, it scared people. And so probably the biggest argument that I've seen, the most common argument that I've seen for what caused the Franks crime in 1924 was that Leopold and Loeb were overeducated or that they had had secular educations. You'll see this present in trying to scare people away from the kinds of books they read, arguing that gay books and mystery stories and philosophy turn them into these murderous deviants. Theme number 3 you're going to see in the newspaper comics is the defense is trying to cheat the justice system. There was a lot of derision over the defense using psychiatric testimony to try to mitigate punishment. It was thought the psychiatrists were just making things up to try to help their case. There was testimony about Loeb talking to his teddy bear as a child, and the idea that Leopold and Loeb's behavior might have been influenced by hormonal imbalances was seen as ridiculous. And so you can see this theme in several comics, cartoons, and there's a poem that was published in a newspaper called Me Too, where a man is sad to find that he has a pituitary gland, which obviously must mean that he's an insane criminal, because that's what the defense was arguing in Leopold and Loeb's case. Again, you are not going to see this kind of argument extending much past 1924. And theme number 4, the defense successfully cheated the justice system. When Leopold and Loeb were spared the death penalty, the general consensus was that money had won over justice. Not that anyone claimed that anyone bribed the judge, but because Leopold and Loeb had been able to afford the best lawyers and psychiatrists, they were given an advantage that poor criminals could never have. So these themes and more were found in other fictionalizations from this time. Sally's Newspaper was the first novel to address the case. It was published 3 days after the sentencing hearing began. Its author was a professor, a college professor, and he was very shaken by the Leopold-Loeb case because he felt like it maybe meant that the education system was wrong, that something had gone really wrong and it needed to change. And he ended up, he gives a lot of reasons, a lot of possible reasons for what happened with Leopold and Loeb in his novel. Some of the big ones were, again, overindulgent parents, a hectic city life. He said specifically like the rapid pace of the city and the noise of the cars and things like that made you kind of anxious and a worse person. And not having done hard labor as children. Several times it said that if the Leopold-Loeb character in that book had done child labor, basically, then he would have grown up to be a better person. And it was in 1924 that the Child Labor Act was being debated, so this was topical. There's also a short story called Speed that was written during the summer of 1924, although it was published later. And that one is actually interested in a psychological character study of a Leopold-Loeb character. That story gives him kind of an amalgamation of traits belonging to Leopold and Loeb, and it has him murder his pregnant girlfriend before running away to Canada. So both of these stories adapt the case, but they don't yet have characters or a crime that were close to the real thing. The novel, there were 2 criminals in that case, but you only ever saw one of them on the page, and he was the amalgamation character, and you never saw the other one. You just know that he's a friend. And they were rapists. The short story had a single killer who was, again, an amalgamation character, and again, his crime is nothing at all like the Leopold-Loeb kidnapping murder. These are the first adaptations in what I call the weird era. So this stretch of years from like 1924 to 1950 saw works of fiction inspired by the case that were all pretty different from each other, and they were different from the actual facts of the case. In this era, there are no ransom attempts, there's no murders of young boys, and there's no characters that seem to be modeled after Leopold specifically or Loeb specifically. And the themes are also going to be pretty diverse. So this era of fiction includes Broken Laws, which is the silent film I referenced. That premiered in November of 1924. It portrayed the evils of mothers loving their kids too much to discipline them. So a misbehaving 8-year-old is shown becoming a criminal 16-year-old who kills an old woman in a car accident. He's charged with manslaughter, and his mother pleads that she should go to jail instead of him, since it's her fault. It turns out this was all a dream, and the mother, learning her lesson, gives her 8-year-old a good spanking. So here we have the theme of overindulgent parents as the cause for Leopold and Loeb's behavior, and corporal punishment being a solution to it. As the movie depicts the teenage character running his car into a wagon and killing a woman, that may have been inspired by an actual car accident that Loeb got into when he was 15. He also ran his car into a horse-drawn wagon, and he was taken to court for it, though he only injured people. He did not kill anyone. And he was taken to court, but it was found in his favor because both Loeb's car and the wagon that he hit, neither of them had lights on. And so it was kind of like a mutual, like, well, you both should have had lights and you both just, you hit each other. There's also a short story from this one called A Passage to Benares, published in 1926. It doesn't adapt the case, but it does make several references to it. So in this story, a young woman is killed in Trinidad, and suspicion turns on an American tourist, in part because educated Americans like Leopold and Loeb are known for committing kills just as an experiment to see how it makes them feel. Though in this short story, the American was innocent. This sentiment is also echoed in the most famous adaptation from this time, the play Rope by Patrick Hamilton, which was first produced on the West End in 1929. Rope sees a pair of Oxford undergraduates kill their classmate, put his body in a chest in their apartment, and throw a dinner party on top of it. So Rope is the first time that the theory of the Nietzschean theory of the Übermensch is brought into things, and the idea of someone killing for a thrill. Like with Sally's newspaper, we have one character who seems to embody traits of both Leopold and Loeb, and the character of Wyndham Brandon, and then there is the other character, Charles Grano, and he's there to make them a pair, but he doesn't seem to have traits of Leopold and Loeb. Like his trait is that he's scared and he doesn't want to get caught. So while Brandon is the one interested in philosophy and he's superior and he's wealthy and blah, 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 Grano is just there. So again, we keep seeing this in this era of a Leopold-Loeb character plus one. That play was made into a movie, a Hitchcock movie in 1948, and a novelization. They're pretty similar in terms of like what happens, like the plotting and the characterization. You can see a similar thing again in the 1935 pulp novel, The Grindle Nightmare. That's about a pair of killers terrorizing like a sleepy New England town with a series of animal and human deaths and mutilations. The killers, again, are a dominant one with Leopold and Loeb traits, and then a more submissive, scared one without Leopold and Loeb traits. That one specifically, like, the dominant character is smart. He's a medical student. He's from Illinois, it's mentioned. He's into psychology and blah, blah, blah. And then the other character is specifically not as smart. He's scared. He eventually commits suicide. Like, I'm not seeing Leopold-Loeb traits in these extra characters. The Grindle Nightmare might be the first time that we actually get textual evidence of Leopold-Loeb characters being in a relationship. A woman specifically remarks in the book that, oh, it's kind of weird. I never see them with a girl. Isn't that kind of odd? And it is not confirmed, but it's mentioned that they might not be able to have normal relationships with people, and so they're kind of sublimating that with these crimes. So there is an outlier. So a lot of those that I've discussed, they're very different from each other, right? Like, you got serial murders and you got a single murder, and the motives of the murder are different, and the locations and the methods of murder are different. But they're a little bit similar in that, like, there usually is one Leopold-Loeb character and maybe an extra one, and usually there's some kind of superiority. There's one that's a total outlier, and that is Richard Wright's Native Son. So this was not just inspired by Leopold and Loeb, but it was inspired by them. In this case, the novel focuses on a man named Bigger Thomas. He is black, and he kills his wealthy white employer as well as his girlfriend, and then he's caught. He knows about Leopold and Loeb, and so he kind of tries to frame a little bit of a ransom. It doesn't work. And then he, stands trial, and the defense in his trial is based almost entirely on the defense in the Leopold-Loeb case, and Richard Wright was kind of using it as this example to say, even with the same defense, and even with a good lawyer like Clarence Darrow, two wealthy Jewish men are able to get life in prison, where a poor black man is sentenced to death. And so it's not an adaptation of Leopold and Loeb. And it's also not interested in what a lot of other adaptations are interested in. It's more the trial, it's more the plight of Black Americans at the time. Even though all of these cases were different, we can see that even though there's not a specifically, like, you're not getting a Leopold character, a Loeb character, you're not getting anybody at all close to a Bobby Franks character. You're not getting kidnappings for ransom. You're not getting people hit on the head with, the blunt end of a chisel. All of these adaptations did involve young male killers. Most of the time they were wealthy, but the themes varied a lot. They went from arguing in favor of child labor, to arguing in favor of hitting your kids, to talking about African-American racism in the justice system, to the danger of people who feel superior to others. And there didn't seem to be at this time a coherent idea about the story or themes of the Leopold-Loeb case, or a sense for who Leopold and Loeb were. And that is going to change dramatically in the 1950s with our new era, the psychology era. This is also known as Leopold's redemption arc. So before we get into this era, we do need to have a catch up with what happened to the real Leopold and Loeb between the 20s and the 50s. So both Leopold and Loeb were sent to Joliet Prison in September of 1924. They would later both end up in Stateville Prison, which was about 5 miles away, and they moved from doing manual labor to clerical work. They did sociological research, and they opened a school for inmates together. During this time, Loeb was doing marginally better in the public eye than Leopold. People who met him in prison tended to favor him. There's stories of chaplains and doctors who worked in the prison who came out and complimented Loeb for his cheerful and helpful personality. Ex-cons say he was well-liked by other prisoners, and Leopold was almost universally less liked by comparison. He was said to be arrogant and depraved, which is probably a word meaning gay. And while Loeb had no punishments on his record, Leopold had several. At one point, he was even accused of helping 7 prisoners escape, and he was interrogated in court about it. So he had a much worse public perception at this time, but that would completely change in 1936 when Loeb was murdered by another inmate. That inmate claimed that he had acted in self-defense when Loeb pulled a straight razor on him and threatened to rape him. Prison officials and police did not believe this story, since Loeb had been cut and stabbed more than 50 times, and his killer had no injuries, so it was very unlikely that Loeb had had the razor and went to attack him, and somehow, miraculously, this other guy managed to not get hurt at all, and then attack him so many times, so much more than you would need to get someone to stop attacking you. Especially because the coroners who looked over his body determined that the first wound had been to Loeb's neck. He was almost decapitated. His throat was cut, and that had been done from behind. So clearly not something that you do in self-defense to try to get someone to stop attacking you. Despite this, the killer was found not guilty of the murder. It was ruled as self-defense, and suddenly Loeb was known as a violent gay rapist. So as the years went on, Leopold continued to do good works within the prison. He ran the school that Loeb had started. He worked in the prison's hospital. In the 40s, he helped out with malaria experiments that were happening in the prison as people were trying to figure out how to better handle malaria, since a lot of soldiers were getting it in World War II. And that work helped him get one of his sentences commuted from 99 years to 85 years. And when that happened, he and his family started really looking at how to enhance his public image with the goal of getting parole. So Leopold started giving interviews in magazines like Time, the Saturday Evening Post, and national newspapers, which highlighted all the good projects he had done and stressed the characterization that he was remorseful and humble. This was emphasized in 1953, 1957, and 1958, when he had lengthy hearings attempting to gain his freedom. His character witnesses described him as gentle and shy, and importantly, Loeb was blamed for the Franks crime. It was stressed that Leopold had only done it because he was Loeb's friend, and he had no taste for crime himself. He just wanted to make Loeb happy. This worked, and Leopold was freed from prison in March of 1958. So that's the atmosphere we're in when we're entering this era. Also, something to keep in mind, America in the 1950s experienced a revitalized interest in psychotherapy and Freud's theories. So you'll start to see a lot more exploration of the entire childhood and young adulthoods of these Leopold-Loeb characters as authors try to really understand what happened to make them kill. Instead of mocking the psychiatric theories, authors were actively engaging with them now. This era began with something that doesn't really emphasize it as much. It is The Two Boys from Chicago, which is a 25-minute Australian radio play from 1953. This is the first piece I was able to find that used everyone's real names. It focuses on the sentencing hearing, but there are also flashbacks to the crime itself, where Loeb is shown to be confident and happy as they dispose of the body, while Leopold is fearful. Loeb's governess is interrogated on the stand and says that he was born evil. This radio play came and went without, much of a fuss. The heavy hitter that would define this era and continues to define fiction and nonfiction today, this actually helped Leopold get paroled, is the novel Compulsion by Meyer Levin. This was published in 1956. This novel changes a few things, and it changes all the names of the characters, but the events are almost identical to the real case. And most characters have direct analogs. So the character of Artie Strauss in Compulsion is a direct analog of Richard Loeb. The novel spends hundreds of pages delving into the psychology of its killers, characterizing the Loeb character as a delusional schizophrenic who has killed before on his own and has trouble recognizing reality from fantasy, and he's extremely jealous of his little brother, which is a psychological reason for him to kill Bobby Franks, who is a young boy similar to his brother. The Leopold character is like a pseudo-homosexual who commits the Franks murder to kill the girl version of himself, and then be reborn as a heterosexual man. And this works. After the murder, he finds a girlfriend, and one of the tragedies of the book is that he didn't meet this girl sooner, that he didn't meet her before he met Artie, the Loeb character. The courtroom defense arguments are also gone into extensively, as is the investigation into the crime. This is the first adaptation that seemed really interested in capturing as many angles of the case as possible. So you get the crime, the investigation, the psychology, family lives, the media, and it was the first to include the fact that Leopold and Loeb were Jewish, working in the idea that some Jewish self-hatred was at play in that murder. That is pretty universally something that gets dropped in Leopold-Loeb adaptations. Even as they stick close to the case in other aspects, Leopold and Loeb being Jewish is not seen as important or interesting. It is really not interrogated in most adaptations. So this kind of psychological focus, and specifically that characterization of the Leopold and Loeb characters, would become the gold standard in fiction going forward. Look out for many more Loeb characters who seem to dislike the Leopold character, Loeb characters who are crazy, who are jealous of their brother, and who are the instigator of the crimes. As well as many Leopolds who are less interested in crime. They're in love with Loeb and willing to do anything for him, and they rehabilitate in the end. This kind of characterization would be pushed, as Compulsion was on the New York Times bestseller list for over a year. It spawned a Broadway play and a movie with Orson Welles and Dean Stockwell. The movie and the play were similar to the book, though the movie cut the Jewish angle and relegated the queer aspect much more to subtext, where the book and the play discuss those topics directly. The typical theming of this era would appear again in James Yaff's Nothing But the Night from 1957. That saw the case transported to 1950s Manhattan, but had a similar focus on the psychology and family lives, this time placing much of the blame on the parents of the killers. The Loeb's cold, optics-focused father blamed for making his son heartless, and the Leopold's overbearing mother blamed for making him sensitive, gay, and malleable to Loeb's influence. But again, the Loeb character is the domineering one. He's the one who plans the crime, and he goes crazy in prison, while the Leopold is extremely sweet. He immediately confesses to their crime after they do it, and he's a good boy in prison. This characterization is seen again in Mary Carter Roberts' Little Brother Fate, also from 1957, in which their crime is blamed mostly on how closely intertwined the Leopold-Loeb characters are. The Loeb character in this one is a gay pedophile who kills the Bobby Franks character because he's attracted to him, and is later said to become a wild homosexual before being killed in prison. Clearly, that adaptation was heavily inspired by Loeb's death and the rumors around it. The Leopold character in that version has almost no personality at all, beyond being a follower of the Loeb character. There are a lot of other similar stories from this era, including a French novel, which was a mix of real facts, things from Compulsion, and then just full chunks taken out of a Saturday Evening Post article series about Leopold's redemption. There's also Chicago 24, which was a jazz ballet, which was intended as a psychological study of the murderers. It focused on their relationship with each other and the relationship that they had with their mothers. There's also To Kill for Kicks, which is a horror comic from 1971, which focused a lot on the investigation. There was also a TV episode from 1957, which focused only on Leopold's time in the malaria experiments and portrays him as extremely pathetic, remorseful, good-hearted, and rehabilitated. In an era that seemed to have solidified the story and the characterizations, there's only one big standout, which is the story The Death of Dickie Draper by Jerome Weidman. This was written in 1952, when Leopold was near the beginning of his kind of positive parole publicity push, and Weidman used his story as a cautionary tale, exploring what may actually happen if he was freed. His Leopold character is shown to be obsessed with the past and hurt when people he meets have never heard of him or his crime. He's paroled, he walks around the city of his youth and the city of his crime, and he thinks back fondly on the murder until he realizes that he hasn't changed at all, and he sends himself back to prison to protect humanity from himself. When this story was eventually published in 1964, 6 years after Leopold was paroled, several viewers commented that though it was a good story, it wasn't true to life. And at this point, it's probably a good time to check in with the reality of the situation, and this is going to be the last time we do this. Leopold was released from parole in 1958. He moved to Puerto Rico. There he worked several jobs doing medical and research work. He taught college and high school math. He got a social work degree. He did fundraising for a church group. He got married, started a charity, traveled the world. He spoke out about abolishing capital punishment and reforming prisons. He died in 1971, and newspapers were filled with articles about how reformed he was and what good things he'd done with his life. This was not the full truth of the situation. Leopold committed charity fraud and statutory rape. He cheated on his wife constantly with teenage boys and young men, and he never seemed to actually have felt remorse for killing Bobby Franks. I have read thousands of letters that he has sent, and other than when he was trying to get paroled, he never talks about being remorseful. In these letters, he talks about feeling cheated, that he feels like he shouldn't have had his life taken away from him by being sent to prison. And he did occasionally make jokes about the murder, but actually thinking about Bobby or the Franks family or actual remorse, I did not find it. But that kind of stuff was not publicly known, so it didn't impact the fiction that's been made about them. And that leads to the beginning of our next era, but here things kind of split. But there's several threads we're going to follow going forward. So the first is the gay era. The 1970s saw gay liberation in full force, and with it came gay men reevaluating the old case. So during the psychology era, there was an openness about the gay relationship. Like a lot of those adaptations talked about it directly, but it was pathologized. So while Leopold was seen as not as bad as Loeb, him being gay or in love with the Loeb character still showed that he was sick in those early adaptations. But now that it was being reevaluated, especially by gay men, it just made Leopold super sympathetic that he was gay and that he was in love with Loeb. He was really seen as a gay teenager who fell in love with the wrong guy. In this case, Loeb, who was seen as an insane, usually straight, violent criminal who led him to destroy his life for love. These kinds of stories can be seen in Never the Sinner by John Logan and For Robert's Sake, which both came out in 1983. These were plays focused on the relationship between Leopold and Loeb, and they both used their real names. So Never the Sinner in particular starts with the statement, "This is a love story." Sinner focused on the story of these guys and the homophobic world they've been born into, and how they navigated that with their girlfriends, and how their sexuality was used against them in the press and during their sentencing hearing. The same can be seen in 1992's Swoon, which is a movie, again, focused on their relationship. All of these adaptations showed a charismatic Loeb and a more nerdy, stoic, and in-love Leopold, who is less enthused about the murder than Loeb is. In Swoon, this is apparent as Loeb grins with Bobby's blood in his mouth and Leopold panics, his hands shaking as he drives the car. A more exaggerated master-slave kind of dynamic between the pair was seen in 1997's Leopold and Loeb, which was a play by George Singer, which also focused on the homophobia. At one point, Leopold asks Loeb, "Why couldn't we just have loved one another?" And Loeb replies, "How?" Because the thought was that in the 1920s, they wouldn't have even understood how they could be in a relationship because they had no model for it. I disagree with this. Plenty of queer people at the time had perfectly fine relationships. This is also the focus of the musical Thrill Me, that premiered in 2003. That has the same kind of dynamic of a crime-obsessed Loeb and an in-love Leopold, with the added element that Leopold got the pair caught on purpose by dropping his glasses purposely at the scene of the crime so that they would always be together. This dynamic continues to be repeated today. You can see it in Foy Ado by David Stalling, Sticky and Babe by Daniel Henning, Homo Superiors by L.A. Fields, Nothing But the Night by Casey Krantz, Ubermensch by D.L. Scarp, and Twisted Bargain by Michael Mizrahi. This characterization is usually the dominant one in pieces made by gay men. These directors and writers that I've interviewed often say that they see themselves in Leopold, and they see Loeb as a straight man that they crushed on or a bad boyfriend that they had. And almost none of these stories that are focused on the relationship go past 1924. Some of these don't even include the murder or any characters other than Leopold and Loeb themselves. A lot of the plays, there will only be two actors. There's a Leopold and a Loeb, and that's all you get. And quite a few of them stop before the murder even happens, because what's interesting is the relationship, is the buildup to these people. And the motive in this kind of story tends to be Loeb loved crime, Leopold loved Loeb. There's also usually a lot more interest and time put into Leopold's characterization than there is to Loeb's, but you don't see a lot of their family lives or their relationships with other people. As for who or what is to blame for their crime, what happened to Loeb to make him that way usually isn't explored. Sometimes he feels neglected by his family, but not to an extent that explains his actions. Leopold's problems tend to be blamed on loving Loeb too much and living in a homophobic society that didn't make it easy for him to find a better partner. I'm being hyperbolic here. It's not as if the Leopold characters in these adaptations are seen as completely innocent. They are usually shown to be arrogant, to be into Nietzsche's idea of the Übermensch, although sometimes that is taken away from him, given to just Loeb, who did not care about that in reality. And these Leopolds do seem to feel superior to other people, but they're specifically not interested in crime themselves. They don't want to commit murder, and they are often shown feeling remorse, where the Loeb characters typically are not. Another subset of fiction, not as popular but still noteworthy, is Leopold's Rehabilitated life. So these are works of fiction which focus on Leopold's later life and his supposed rehabilitation. This includes 1988 Prisoners, which is a play about a 15-year-old girl contemplating suicide, and Nathan Leopold as an angel comes down to talk her out of it. Leopold also talks a blind prisoner out of suicide in 2017's graphic novel The Hunting Accident. There he's shown having to come to terms with the fact that Loeb never loved him in order to move on and heal, which is something that we're going to see a lot in this subgenre. Several short stories also fit in here. There's Dear Mr. Kleska, which shows Leopold answering hate mail in Puerto Rico, and the short story Out of Love, which repeats the point of Leopold realizing Loeb never loved him, which he's able to see in his old age now that he's religious and repentant. It's represented again in the play In the Aftermath of Mercy, which shows Leopold leaving prison and his first few months in Puerto Rico, falling in love with his future wife, fighting against prejudice, and learning to leave behind the abusive ghost of Loeb, who has constantly berated him throughout the play. While elements of these works show up in other adaptations, they are the focus here. Even more than the romance-focused ones, these really emphasize the idea that Leopold committed crimes because he loved Loeb, and now that Loeb is dead, Leopold is able to move on with his life and to be a much better, happier person. And now we reach a subset that I'm really going to have to pay more attention to during my reappraisal, which are the detective novels, mysteries, and thrillers. So there's a ton of these kinds of books which have Leopold-Loeb style killers, and I'm really interested to see if I can recognize any patterns in the characterization or motives of these guys over the years. So The Grindle Nightmare can be seen as an early example of this, but the genre really kicked off in 1974 with Super Cop Joe Blaze, The Thrill Killers, which is an amazing, pulpy action novel. Other popular examples include The Face of Fear by Dean Koontz, 3 of James Patterson's first novels, and episodes of shows FBI Most Wanted, Criminal Minds, and SVU. These are almost always much further from the reality of the Leopold-Loeb case. They're not interested in recreating, usually, the kind of kidnap, ransom kind of Bobby plot. They usually drop the gay angle. They don't have the killers be involved with each other. Notable exceptions include Maxwell's Chain and Ripper. Again, the Jewish angle is almost always gone, and often only one of the characters is wealthy or intelligent. The desire to commit a perfect crime is often a motivation, as is the idea that the characters need to prove their superiority over other people. The crime they commit is usually serial murder, rather than kidnapping. And hitting someone with a blunt instrument followed by suffocation is usually not the murder method these killers use. Sometimes, if there are 2 killers, a leader-follower dynamic can be seen, and sometimes one is shown to be more reluctant or remorseful, but just as often, these killers work in tandem, and they're equally culpable. A subset of this genre is the copycats, where you get criminals who deliberately set out to copy the Leopold-Loeb crime. Usually this is done because they think they can do it better and not get caught. They're almost always wrong. Examples of this include the Maynard Hayes affair from 1979, in which a gay couple committed a Leopold-Loeb crime as teenagers, like specifically the whole thing, kill a young teen boy, put his body in a culvert kind of thing. And they get away with that. As adults, when rumors about the relationship start to get out, one of them gets married off, but he ends up falling in love with his wife. And so he tries to break off the relationship that he's had with his boyfriend. And a fight ensues, and there's blackmail. The boyfriend is trying to force the other guy to get rid of his wife. Otherwise, he'll expose, the murder that they did. Getting away with a Leopold-Loeb crime and then getting caught for a different crime later in life is also seen in Past Resort by Cordelia Rook and the Criminal Minds episode True Genius. Another theme here is the metatextual one. So starting in the 90s, we begin to see a lot of metatextual fiction, which adapts not just the case itself, but it's also examining past representations and how the case has been talked about over time. The 90s was big on this in general. Obviously, you've got Scream kicking off the meta-horror genre in 1996, which that was very slightly inspired by Leopold-Loeb. The greatest example of this in terms of Leopold-Loeb are a series of 3 plays put on by the Butane Group from 1992 to 1995, and are called Leopold-Loeb, Get It Up, Leopold-Loeb, A Goddamn Laugh Riot, and Leopold-Loeb Are Dead Now. All of them use 2 or 3 Leopold-Loeb actors at the same time, sometimes acting in the same scenes together, sometimes on opposite sides of the stage in their own world or interacting with the audience. The plays used pieces from earlier adaptations as well as original material, and they would sometimes do scenes over and over again trying to find the right tone, really reflecting on how many angles there were to these people and how complicated their story and stories about them have become over the years. A meta angle was also used in Nikki Silver's play The Agony and the Agony, in which the main character is writing a play about Leopold-Loeb. When Leopold appears in his apartment, and he spends the rest of the play walking around, complaining about the trend of fictional adaptations, including him, especially when they're poorly written and inaccurate. See also the play Golden Age by Roberto Aguirre-Sacasa, where Archie Andrews, the comic book character, is gay and hooks up with Nathan Leopold in college before the Franks murder. There's also The Future Was Looking Better in the Past, which is an interpretive dance about a girl connecting the narcissism that led to the Franks murder as analogous with the artistic creative process. The creator of this dance was inspired when she found out that she had a familial tie to this case. Now, the last big subset I'm going to talk about here is modern issues, where the Leopold-Loeb case is used to comment on social or political issues that weren't relevant to the original case. Native Son arguably did this, but it didn't gain popularity really until Hollow Fires in 2022. That novel is a modernization of the case that has Leopold-Loeb be alt-right, racist Islamophobes who kill an Iranian immigrant boy. And the novel focuses on police brutality. The Leopold-Loeb characters in that are wealthy and intelligent, but they're no longer queer or Jewish. They were radicalized online. We also see this in Jazzed, which also was published in 2022, which is a gender-swapped version. It focuses on anti-black racism, anti-Semitism, and the misogyny and homophobia faced by queer women in the 20s, including one of those women being given corrective electroshock therapy in prison. It reappeared again in the opera Hindsight, which kept the Leopold-Loeb names, plot, and time period true to life, but connected it again to racism by having Bobby be played by a black actor, and connecting it to the political moment by having Leopold-Loeb repeat Donald Trump quotes and tying them to white supremacist neo-Nazis. While writers have always connected the Leopold-Loeb case with issues they were seeing in their time, it seems more common right now to add in new issues that were in no way connected to the original case. Maybe this means that the original bones of Leopold-Loeb are losing their relevance, and writers are kind of having to stretch to make the comparison work. Time will tell. Then, of course, there are a ton of outliers. I didn't make a perfect system here. You've got your popular things like The Secret History by Donna Tartt, a group of intellectuals who think they're better than everyone, killing one of their own in an attempt not to get caught for a different murder. The original Scream, which writer Kevin Williamson attributed to deciding to make there be 2 ghost-based killers, one a leader and the other a follower. There's also works that are inspired by fictional adaptations. I could do a microcosm list, with just movies that were inspired by rope. That one would be a little more boring because honestly, if something is inspired by rope, it usually just means a body was hidden inside of a piece of furniture. Okay, so obviously this list is a mess. That's why I need to do my reread and rewatch before I try to write anything substantial on this topic. But one thing I do find fascinating is that there are so many things that people find interesting enough about the case that they get inspired to create art about it. Somebody looks at Leopold-Loeb and they see a moving story about the possibility of rehabilitation, or maybe they see a tragic love story about a couple of kids born into a homophobic time, or maybe they see a cautionary tale about the danger of privilege and feeling superior to others. There are seemingly so many angles that people can explore, which is why I think that 100 years later, people are still being inspired by this case. But even with all these adaptations, there's so much that has never been covered, at least as far as I can tell. Bobby Franks is almost never seen other than being killed, if then. This is pretty strange. Other crimes, like the Columbine shooting, inspired a lot of victim and victim family-centric adaptations, and not as much interest in the killers themselves. Obviously, there's plenty of things that have been inspired by the Columbine killers, but if you look at actually like the fictional books and movies about Columbine, at least half of them are from the perspective of victims or the victims' families. There's not a ton that are from the perspective of the killers. The only piece of fiction that gives a Bobby character much to do is Hollow Fires. And in that one, he's just a totally different kid. And also a ghost. A handful of more recent adaptations have tried to show him interacting with Loeb or his family a bit. See specifically like Hearts of Darkness and American Criminals. But it's clear that there's so much more interest in the killers than in the victim in this case. Part of the problem, there's just so little known about Bobby, and it's like, is it more respectful to make things up about him or not write about him at all? In terms of Leopold and Loeb, their friendships and relationships with others are usually not given much thought. Creators really prefer to have them be insular within their relationship with each other. Very little time is given to their childhoods, other than sometimes covering their relationships with their governesses. What's odd to me is that the first time Leopold and Loeb planned to commit murder but didn't go through with it, which happened in 1921, is almost never mentioned. Even though it had most of the hallmarks of what would become the Franks crime, like they planned to use a chisel and rope and things like that, and to kidnap this person. That is just never deemed important enough in fiction. The fiction will usually cover some of their petty crimes, theft, and sometimes, like stealing a car or arson or something like that. But this first time when they sat down and they planned the murder of the guy who walked in on them and then told people about that they saw them in bed together. They wanted to kill him. They wanted to kidnap him and torture him and kill him. But they couldn't figure out how to do it and not have it be obvious that it was them because they had a very obvious motive for wanting to kill him. So they didn't go through with it, but I just find it very odd that fiction kind of ignores that element of their relationship and their criminal journey. Their lives in prison and Leopold's paroled life are usually not delved into. Of course, you'll get it in specifically the subset of fiction that focuses on Leopold's rehabilitation, but that is a very small amount. And typically things that are inspired by the Leopold-Loeb case are inspired by their crime or their trial. And while I love them, I would really love to see people come up with things that push those boundaries. Thank you so much for sitting through this. I hope you'll come along on this journey with me as I try to re-experience the fictional history of this case. If you think of a piece of fiction that I missed that is not on my other lists, please reach out to me. I am compelled to collect as many of these things as I can. You can follow my journey, hopefully on this YouTube channel, but if not here, then on my WordPress, the Loeb Leopold WordPress. And I hope you'll join me as I explore some of this lovely fiction that's behind me that's based on Leopold and Loeb.